You're listening to Necropolis. This is a podcast brought to you by Jason from Goatcraft and Shelley from HateMeditations.com. Welcome to Necropolis. I am Shelley from HateMeditations.com, and this is episode 101, which is a new era for Necropolis. Jason will once again be stepping back because he has gone back to school in September to study philosophy, and his time is now much more limited than it used to be, so he will still be around. He'll be orbiting Necropolis as ever and hopefully joining episodes in the future, but he's given myself and Tyler the keys to Necropolis for now, so we're just going to run riot, carry on, hopefully have a decent churn of episodes for you. We'll just see how it goes. But yeah, as I mentioned, we've got Tyler, as always, joining us. Pretty much a Necropolis staple now. How's it going, Tyler?
It's going pretty good. Excited about today's episode.
Awesome. Yeah, glad to have you for this one. And as compensation for you having to put up with me, we have asked the ever knowledgeable Joseph April to join us once again. How's it going, Joseph?
Hi, Shelley. Hi, Tyler. Doing well.
And you, did you recently get back from a European tour of sorts? How was it?
Yeah, late July into about 2 weeks of August, I went to Norway, the UK, and Ireland, and my wallet is very much feeling it.
Yeah, I'm sorry the dates didn't line up for us to meet up, but yeah, I think you happened to be in the UK when I was heading out to Brutal Assault in the Czech Republic, but...
Yeah, I contemplated going out there for that, because you weren't the only person I knew going to that festival, but I made previous commitments in Ireland, and I would have had to have canceled that.
Yeah, fair enough. Glad you had a good time, and great to have you on. For today's episode, we're going to be chatting about Florida death metal. I've recently been reading the book that was put out on Decibel Books on Scott Burns's career as a producer from around the mid 80s to the mid 90s, and it just got me revisiting a lot of the sort of classic output from the bands from that scene, going back to a lot of records that I hadn't really listened to for a long time. So I thought, why not just do a sort of random episode on it, not really any kind of formal discussion on it, just kind of thoughts on the bands that orbited that scene, what we think of some of those classic albums, what kind of the legacy of it is, and also just sort of incorporating some of the more international bands that kind of, visited Morris Sound in those days, just because obviously Scott Burns was such a name back then and Morris Sound had such a reputation. So we will be discussing some of the bands not necessarily from Florida, but attached to that region. So my opening thoughts really in sort of going back, Florida has produced some of my all-time favorite death metal albums and bands, and none of the names will really be a surprise to you in terms of like, Morbid Angel and Deicide and Atheist and things like that. But I've always in my head tried to kind of encapsulate what the Florida sound is by that I kind of mean you can easily sort of encapsulate what the Swedish death metal sound is if you reach for Dismember, Entombed, Grave and Unleashed and so on. They all have very, very clear similarities, and even if you step outside of that, I don't want to use the word big four, but for want of a better phrase, within Sweden you've got bands like Early Therian and At the Gates, and they're all very distinct, and they do all have a signature sound, but they all are very kind of obviously Northern European in a sense, just with their overall kind of demeanor. Whereas, and also, that could be true of the UK as well, with the sort of the grindcore come latent death metal scene with, bands like Bolt Thrower, Napalm Death and Carcass. They all have a very distinct kind of early earache sound. I mean, you could wrap Godflesh up into there as well, although they're obviously a little bit of an outlier, even though they do have a lot of crossover there. That's very kind of urban, surreal, slightly humorous kind of tone, and very, very derivative of punk as well that the UK sound had. And then you compare that to the Florida sound, and there isn't much commonality there. And I was sort of thinking about this, and I think one of the reasons is a lot of the Florida bands were incredibly formative to death metal. You've obviously got Death, you've got Morbid Angel, you've got Obituary, who are all kind of very, very foundational to death metal and really kind of cut their teeth in the mid 80s before death metal was a known quantity, as it were. So they're all quite young, they're all kind of trying to develop their sound in some way. And then around that time as well, you already have Atheist kind of branching off a little bit and going way more progressive by the late 80s. And then you get kind of, around the turn of the decade, you get the kind of cacophony of bands that bubble up, a lot of them either from other parts of the US or from, you have obviously Sepultura, you have Napalm Death traveling over, who are kind of going in a more death metal direction. And you kind of get this huge explosion of what you'd call kind of sort of typical death metal, what you kind of reach for when you just think of like an archetypical version of death metal in your mind. And then it sort of branches off into all of these different directions. And I think because Florida was always at the cutting edge of that, there isn't really a typical like sound that comes out of Florida. They're all very, very distinct in their own different ways. So I'll call on Joseph first. What are your kind of initial thoughts on like whether there is an essence of like late 80s, early 90s, like Florida death metal sound, or whether there is something to the fact that they are just a myriad of very, very different bands that just happen to be in the same kind of locale?
Well, you have, and I think this is, historically throughout metal, there's been scenes around certain city centers and certain, urban areas. And this is sort of another example compared to like the Bay Area thrash, and then obviously contemporaneously, you have things like Stockholm and such. So I think for whatever reason, Tampa, Florida kind of became that. I think probably in part because I think this is probably the case with a lot of bands in those sort of scenes. There's usually one or two bands that really get things going, and then all the kids in that area latch onto it and go, oh shit, this is something really cool, we should do this. Whether it's Mayhem in Norway, whether it's Nihilist, and then later Entombed in Sweden. So I think probably the same phenomenon, probably with Death in Florida. Certainly watching the documentary, I forget the name of it, but the documentary about Death, yeah, they interview tons of other people in the scene, and they talk about like going like, oh, have you heard about Chuck? You should check this out. Oh, Chuck's got this demo. You should check this out. And Death demos, I think, not only in Florida but influenced the wider death metal scene, but certainly I think spurred a lot of kids in that area to take an interest. And then, of course, the other aspect is more sound with Scott Burns and Tom Morris, and how that kind of cultivated a certain sound. And as well, I feel like you look at these different scenes internationally, you can usually pinpoint certain studios and certain producers, which I know maybe goes a little against some things you've previously said, Shelley, in terms of, which I agree, I think the songwriting comes first and foremost, but it does seem like scenes do develop both in terms of some sort of progenitor band that just makes kids go wild, and then the professional aspect of some producer or studio that kind of latches onto it and becomes an avenue for those bands.
Yeah, do you mean it goes against some of the things I've said about, like, I don't know, environmental or economic or social factors, or?
I forget which one, but I know I was listening to one of the Hate Meditations recordings you did, and kind of talking about how, production can be a bit more of sort of the aesthetic, or a little bit more kind of skin level. And I agree in the sense that, like, I think it doesn't matter who's producing your album. If the songwriting sucks, the songwriting sucks. I think the same principle applies in film and television. If the screenwriting sucks, that the phrase "you can only polish a turd so much." But if you have an actual gem, the polishing can do quite a bit of wonders, I think.
Yeah, I mean, not to take us too far off track, but I will just sort of comment, like, I think partly why I keep banging that drum is because there is a tendency that I notice in more recent metal, like, commentary, for want of a better word, either, whether that's commentary I see online or reviews or whatever of newer releases, where there is an overemphasis on texture, sort of whether that be choice of instruments, production, anything like that. Whereas for me, first and foremost, I'm always looking for what is it doing at compositional level. But as I've said, I always think black metal is like a perfect example of where the two inform each other. They're absolutely essential. Like, you wouldn't have like the essence of black metal without some of those recordings, the way they sound. And I think, especially after reading this book on Scott Burns and a lot of the albums he worked on, I think I do have more of an appreciation for how that can be just as true with death metal, particularly those earlier recordings when death metal was still quite undefined, and he was one of the first producers to really kind of capture that. So I've never really rated albums like Slowly We Rot, but having revisited it and sort of trying to put myself in the mindset of, like, okay, it's 1989, none of the death metal that you know and love has really been written or recorded yet. How would this sound? You've only really heard, like, Metallica and Slayer and stuff, and it does really bring to life like that music in a way. So I do. Obviously, I don't think the production is like completely irrelevant. And before we started recording, I was mentioning to Tyler, like, Breeding the Spawn being a classic example of how the production really derailed a band's like progression. And that with a very kind of riff-driven band where you are supposed to just focus on like the raw mechanics of the material. But I think I keep banging that drum, as I said, because I think it is kind of forgotten that, as you said, you can't polish a turd. And I think a lot of new releases that I come across sometimes lean too heavily on the amount of stuff that you can do with a home studio now, and sort of covering up mistakes or a lack of imagination at the compositional level.
Well, if anything, I think it just kind of goes to show the limitations of home studio recording, in that you don't have, these sort of experts kind of guiding and as well editing. Like, it's sort of like, almost like home publishing. Like, if you don't have an editor, it might be a crap book. How many great novels are in part due to an editor going, "Please remove this"?
No, you're absolutely right. And the number of times that comes up in the Scott Burns book, like, it has interviews with all of the bands, the famous bands that he's worked with, and they all say, like, they treated him like another member of the band, as far as him giving hints and tips and feedback on takes, or like, he's obviously a really humble guy. He doesn't like to say he gets involved in the songwriting process, because that's down to the bands themselves. But because he has that ear for guitar tone, for tempo, if a take is out of time or whatever, he'll offer that. And I think that's one of the other things that makes the Florida scene stand apart, because it saw death metal go from this very amateur underground thing into a professional setting, in a way, and that obviously had its downsides in that it did become a bit of a production line eventually. But in the early days, it was like no one had heard recordings as professionally sounding as something like, even like Leprosy at the time, which sounds rough as hell now, but you compare it to Scream Bloody Gore, and it's light years ahead in terms of the way it sounds, and ditto for like Slowly We Rot. Before we get too far into this, though, Tyler, what are your sort of general thoughts on the Florida death metal scene before we sort of get into it?
Not anything too different from what's been said already. It's a really interesting phenomenon to examine because, as you already said, with bands like Morbid Angel, Obituary, Deicide, you really have, in the early days of the Florida death metal scene, not so much a sound as music that was foundational to the death metal genre as a whole. I do think that over time they're solidified what you could call a Florida death metal sound, to the extent that said sound is imitated today by various groups within what the brief trend called the new wave of old school death metal. Um, and we can unpack that more as we get further into the discussion. Um, but yeah, it's really interesting to look at the notion of Florida death metal being a scene as compared to the other popular scenes within the death metal genre, like the Swedish death metal scene or the Finnish death metal scene, because while not the case absolutely, those scenes largely had a kind of shared sound amongst the band, a shared approach to songwriting that isn't as much the case with the Florida scene.
Yeah, and I guess to sort of touch on something Joseph mentioned, particularly in relation to Def and Chuck's kind of influence over a lot of younger people at the time, I think one of the keys to the kind of variety within that area is you do have a lot of larger than life characters, much like you have in Norway. Because Morbid Angel is full of like, I mean, we've done a focus episode on them previously, and a lot of that was discussions around the push and pull between the various people that have been involved in that project. Did so for Def. Chuck he's a really sort of, he was a really interesting kind of character to look at when you hear people who knew him at the time kind of speak about him. And then, you know, there's still the really kind of influential sort of pillars of that scene, but might be slightly lesser known to those outside of like the death metal oeuvre, like Cam Lee, who is kind of credited as developing the death metal sound. Lots of interesting characters surrounding like Obituary and Atheist and things like that. And as again we were chatting just before we hit record, it's very unusual to have a producer in Scott Burns who has that celebrity status within metal, because metal in general is very, very kind of artist focused and album focused, and sometimes we don't always dig behind who's responsible for production in the same way. But because Scott Burns was so formative to developing that, as I said, as professionalizing death metal to some extent, he has become like a household name within death metal at large, well outside of Florida. Just to kind of bring it, because this is probably me trying to be a little bit too like anally retentive and archiving things, but I did kind of list some of the key bands, a lot of whom we've already mentioned, but kind of trying to like categorize them in some way. So we've mentioned like Morbid Angel and Obituary and Death as like the foundational ones, but part of the sort of the traditional wing, I guess we could talk about them first. The traditional wing of like the Florida scene, specifically in Massacre and Obituary, as like the ones that were, so Massacre famously formed in about 1984, but never got around to releasing an album until 1991. But Cam Lee, obviously, he was in Mantis with Chuck prior to that. But when From Beyond did eventually come out, it was seen as a throwback even by 1991, because it is very straightforward and very direct. I think when we did our 91 tier list, I probably came down a little bit too hard because I'd had one too many beers, but I do genuinely appreciate that album. But it is very, very simplistic and direct. And then obviously you have Obituary, especially their first three albums, very, very kind of, I don't want to say rudimentary because that sounds a little bit derogatory, but it is very, very kind of straightforward by the numbers death metal, but that still kind of really works, especially on Cause of Death, which is my favorite Obituary album, and it's kind of just a really, really solid piece of like Celtic Frost infused death metal. And then you obviously have, well, I was going to mention Cannibal Corpse. No, they're not from Florida, although they did move down eventually, but we probably have mixed opinions on Cannibal Corpse. Tyler and I have discussed them on previous tier lists, and obviously we don't particularly rate them, but they are obviously a cornerstone of the development of Florida death metal in particular and death metal at large because they did become one of its biggest bands. And in the early days, you can see them sort of evolving out of thrash into trying to become something more technical and tighter. And again, Scott Burns was like played a key role in that. So do you have any sort of general comments on like those bands being forming the traditional wing? I guess you could lump the first two Death albums in there as well as like this is like the ground level of where Florida death metal and death metal at large kind of started to take shape.
Tyler, Tyler, if you actually want to go first, you can.
Sure, no problem. Yeah, I think that, there's obviously a real controversial debate about who formed death metal. And some people can get really intense about it. I think a lot of it centers around the celebrity status of Death, who's often cited as the creator of death metal. It's convenient too, the band is named Death after all. It kind of fits in with a mythos of sorts. But other people will want to bring up bands like Possessed, who are obviously from California, Master, who wasn't from Florida, but I believe had their debut album eventually recorded there by Scott Burns in 1990. Um, and bring up the fact that Sepultura's debut EP came out in 85, I believe.
86, I think it was.
86, okay. Um, and eventually Sepultura themselves would also record albums in Florida with Scott Burns. Um, so it's an interesting topic to touch on is like what did these bands represent to early death metal and what exactly was their place? I think Cam Lee from Massacre is one who has recently, although it could be motivated by personal reasons, come out and said that he takes the position that death was not as influential to the very earliest days of death metal as his celebrity status would lead you to believe. Um, I'm kind of agnostic on the position. I don't really know because this was far before my time. What bands had the most influence or not? I think it's inarguable that that death had a huge influence on early death metal, and obviously they're a very, especially in their at least in their early albums, a very traditional form of that. If that's kind of what angle you're approaching there, Shelley, along with Obituary and their pre-Obituary form as Executioner. There is not. This was obviously before the days that death metal started to have a desire to be taken seriously and started to stretch itself out in directions that for the genre were experimental. I did want to bring up the obviously Morbid Angel and Deicide as well, who recorded their demos, as well as I think their at least their first album in Florida, who their rivalry of sorts with Morbid Angel, I think, contributed to kind of the development of the early death metal genre as well. And it's interesting to read about the earliest days of Morbid Angel and Deicide in particular in regards to Florida death metal because you really get something that is vaguely reminiscent of the kind of legends of the Norwegian black metal scene. Talks of pre-Deicide Carnage shows at which they filled a mannequin up with meat and threw it into the crowd. And Morbid Angel, who were also present at the show, let their pit bulls loose on it, which I think kind of speaks to the fact that death metal at this point in time, you could almost say, had a more extreme, I don't want to say reputation, but attitude than it did later on. I feel like it in its earliest days was almost something more comparable to the extremity that you saw attempted at least by the Norwegian black metal bands, where these people were really trying to come across as something satanic and violent and dark. I don't. It obviously is before the days that the attitude that became prevalent in death metal later won out over most death metal bands, which was the attitude of, yeah, we have music, we write music about extreme topics that are violent or dark or occult, but we don't really believe that stuff. It's theater. So you can't accuse us of being violent people, of being bad people. They're the same way you wouldn't accuse a horror movie director of being that kind of person. Um, but anyway, sorry to ramble on for a little bit. Any thoughts, Joseph, on what I was saying?
Um, yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting story with the gore there and the dogs and everything. I mean, I think it's probably relatable in that you could probably compare it to a lot of early days and other scenes, in terms of how there was probably reputation of like, oh, if you go to that gig, it could be a bit dangerous. Like, I think, maybe not to quite that extent, but even like early days of thrash, you're going to probably makeshift venues with very little security. I mean, certainly the reputation hardcore punk had in the early 80s with like cops breaking up shows and stuff. I think, there's a certain danger. And I think it's not that surprising that some of that would give way, in that it's just a consequence of teenagers with nothing to lose suddenly becoming young men, and occasionally young women with things they had to kind of care about in day-to-day lives. So that, sort of these antics become less common.
Yeah, I think the thing that is really interesting about the development of particularly the bands you mentioned, Tyler, is how someone like Scott Burns was like a mediating figure between the bands and their antics and the like label bosses and the so-called grown-ups. By label bosses, I'm specifically talking about Roadrunner here, because Scott was like a few years old than most of the bands that he recorded. He was kind of in between the two, and that was one of the reasons why so many people trusted him, because he wasn't some old balding grey producer guy that didn't understand death metal. He was really into it. He was really into his punk and he was really into his metal. So he kind of understood these kids, but he was also very aware that Morrisound was a professional studio and it cost quite a lot of money to record there. And Roadrunner, and Metal Blade, for Cannibal Corpse, and occasionally Earache were fronting the money for that. And he was very aware that the bands couldn't waste their time and they couldn't damage the kit and they had to act responsibly and stuff. And there is that, there's something to be said for maybe that was, we'd call it the maturation of death metal, but the antics kind of fell away at that point, because by 91 death metal was quite a lucrative product. I'm saying that in scare quotes just because, considering how extreme it was lucrative. It wasn't obviously anywhere near on the scale of what Metallica or Iron Maiden were turning over, but there was money involved and the bands were expected to act responsibly. And someone like Deicide, specifically Glenn Blenton, would obviously be considered a bit of a liability at times in terms of his antics, off stage as well as on stage. And I think that's one of the interesting things and one of the reasons why Florida, outside of the bands it produced, became such like a flashpoint for a lot of this. And as we've already sort of touched on, death is a really interesting one, because I've heard people say, Cam Lee, who we've had on the podcast before, amongst others, say that when Scream, like as Joseph already mentioned, there were so many death demos that Chuck was like distributing prior to the release of Scream Bloody Gore. And I've heard people say that when that album finally arrived, it was kind of a letdown. It didn't really sort of advance the genre much beyond Seven Churches. But in revisiting it now, I think it does. I think there is a lot to recommend that album. And I was just re-listening to Leprosy prior to coming on the podcast, and yeah, there are some like moments where that album um, kind of feels like it's leaning too heavily on predictable formats and kind of verse chorus, a little bit pop hooky in places. But I think again, putting yourself in the mindset of someone in '88 when it was released, it's like you can see why it was such like a formative death metal album. And in many ways, although Chuck is entirely different in terms of public persona to someone like Euronymous, I do kind of place him in the same category as someone that was, you wouldn't have death metal in its current form without Chuck. Ditto for Euronymous and black metal. But he was also surrounded by people that might have maybe understood how to communicate the genre on a musical level more than he did. And I think that's really borne out by the pivot that Death took to progressive death metal, which kind of happened after Cynic and after Atheist. Don't forget that like Piece of Time, it was released in 1990, but I think they recorded it in '88, and a lot of those tracks were written much earlier. So Atheist were kind of already going in the progressive direction from the get-go, and Chuck was always like had one eye on what the scene was doing, one eye on what he was doing. A lot of people looked up to him. I don't think anyone could deny that, but he was also very aware of like what others in the scene were doing and whether he should be kind of going with that and always keeping his like finger on the pulse. And I think we might as well move into that progressive category as well, because this is the other interesting dimension to it. So we've discussed some of those really formative bands, but you also have acts like Atheist, acts like Cynic, and acts like Nocturnus, who also came out of Morbid Angel, who it is surprising that almost at its inception, this is only a year or two after, Slowly We Rot and Altars of Madness was released, and you already have albums like The Key, Piece of Time, and Unquestionable Presence, and then Cynic, I think they put a demo out in 1990 and delayed getting Focus out, but Focus is kind of so far to left field, it sort of leaves the territory of death metal. But does anyone have any sort of general comments on like the progressive turn that death metal took at that time?
Sorry to counteract, but before we get into that,
yeah, that's fine. No, go ahead.
I did want to make a note about that the 80s and kind of that transitional period. I mean, certainly with Possess, I feel like Possess kind of has for death metal what Venom had with black metal, in that they kind of coined the term, but most people don't necessarily think musically they started. I mean, to a certain extent, but you listen to Seven Churches, it's still very thrash metal. It's definitely moving away in the same way Sepultura is moving away. But then I think Death in some ways did solidify it. And I think it's just interesting, in 1987, you've got Scream, Bloody Gore, and then same year you've got Napalm Death with Scum. And I feel like those are weirdly the two kind of polar beginnings where, again, other stuff was happening, but where you can see death metal and grindcore, and then how interwoven those would both become kind of beginning. And obviously we can discuss probably coming up here how, to the point that even Napalm Death by 1990 goes to more sound. And the other thing with Chuck, actually, no, I don't really have a train of thought for that, but I just wanted to comment on that. And then also the fact that even outside of the Florida scene, how pivotal that was, in that Chuck had brought in all these different musicians. I mean, he had brought in, members of Repulsion. He brought in members that eventually become Autopsy. So that kind of, even outside of Florida, him influencing the American scene in that sense.
Well, yeah, and that's again where I compare him to Euronymous, because Euronymous had notoriously a lot of pen pals around the world, sort of connecting up the international element of black metal as well, and just maintaining that level of correspondence. And yeah, I do tend to agree with the Possessed comment. I obviously think it is a pivotal moment in the evolution of death metal, but I never place it in my mind as like a death metal album proper.
Yeah. I think the comparison with Venom's black metal is somewhat apt. Again, not note for note, but somewhat apt.
Yeah. And let's not forget,
Uh,
Morbid Angel had recorded Abominations of Desolation, although it was never officially released until '91. It was out there in bootleg form by '86, I think. So it was obviously playing a role in this.
True, true.
right. And I think it just also it's interesting to talk about this in regards to both the development of death metal in a progressive direction and in regards to what influence did these figures and their bands have on the scene. Because you with like Chuck Schuldiner and Death, um, it it how his influence upon death metal I think is I would almost say somewhat contingent upon what you define as death metal and what you define as something moving almost in a different direction because you can talk about the influence in the early period of the scene, which I think is a hotly debated topic. Um, and I agree with like for instance the analysis of Possessed. There's still a lot of elements of it that are, you know, thrash metal. But if you look at the like strains of death metal today, um, you can kind of see different layers of the death metal scene, and the layer of the death metal scene in which Chuck Schuldiner is cited much more often, in my opinion, is something that I think some parts of the scene, not all parts of the scene, would consider almost a more mainstream part of the death metal scene, like technical and progressive death metal, which I think, like I said, got a lot ended up becoming oddly enough, had a lot more mainstream coverage as time went on, and ended up having a much bigger influence on even more mainstream genres. Like I think that deathcore has a significant amount of influence from technical death metal and progressive death metal. Um, but if you look at like the what some people, and this may not, and I'm not saying that this is accurate, what some people would consider the true death metal scene, like the raw, dark, evil death metal underground scene that still exists today. Um, Death is cited a lot less often amongst those groups of people, and you will hear Possessed brought up by those people a lot more seemingly than you'll hear Death brought up. Um, it's I think that's an interesting thing to look at in terms of the debate of Death's influence. But I'm not trying to undermine his influence by saying that. I think it's inarguable that he had a huge influence upon the scene.
Um, just brief commentary on that. I don't think you're wrong necessarily in any way with that. Just for the context with it. No, you're right that death, like if we look at the very kind of underground death metal running today, is usually not cited as much. I do think when death does get cited, it is for Scream Bloody Gore, because Scream Bloody Gore does have that sort of, for lack of a better term, amateurish kind of sort of violent fantasy feel to it, and certainly with the lyrical subject matter. And I think it permeates that. And certainly that scene, one of the biggest bands is Autopsy. And, you know, I think from Scream Bloody Gore, you get right into the early Autopsy albums. So I think it's there. But, you know, Chuck moved on pretty quickly from that. And even something like Leprosy, and I think it's as mentioned because there's a bit of a shift in terms of themes and certainly the production being less necro. Certainly.
Oh,
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, Incantation covered Scream Bloody Gore. Sorry, Shelley. Go on.
no, I was just going to say, I think the thing that was happening is Chuck was, I think he was always a fan of like quote unquote traditional heavy metal, but I think it was coming through a lot more on later works, and not just traditional heavy metal, but progressive metal like Watchtower and things like that. And you can definitely hear that from basically Human onwards. It's very the guitar leads and a lot of the melodies are very kind of bright by death metal standards when you compare it to something like Scream Bloody Gore. And I guess it's kind of just it's where he wanted to go as a musician, but he didn't have the ability in 1987 where he was developing that. And I know he obviously worked with that guitarist from King Diamond, which obviously kind of allowed him to bring that more to the forefront. And that's probably where the mainstream element that you're mentioning, Tyler, mainstream in a relative sense of the word, is kind of coming through, because although the progressive era of death is still death metal, still quite extreme. It is quite accessible in terms of its sort of melodic content, and the tracks can be, fairly easy to follow compared to something that's much more primitive and kind of feral in a lot of ways. And I think this kind of speaks to the fact that we might be jumping ahead here in terms of the history of it, but when death metal kind of fell off a cliff in terms of popularity by the mid 90s, a lot of these bands kind of did a lot of soul searching. Some of them kind of, went the way of like Pantera and tried to write groove metal. Some of them left the scene entirely. But when it picked up again in popularity by the late 2000s, early 2010s, and you have the sort of wave of old school death metal, there are different layers to that. And, there are some levels of fans, I don't want to call them casual because I don't think that's necessarily true, but some of those fans that really do prefer the kind of the stuff that calls back to, I don't know, like things like Watchtower and, Queensryche and things that references that, but in a death metal context. And then there is another layer of fans that really does want the references to the really old stuff, or as Joseph mentioned, like stuff like Autopsy, who are kind of, one of the things that picked up on Scream Bloody Gore and kind of, to my mind, did it better, but that's kind of by the by. But yeah, they are one of the sort of pillars of that primitive style of death metal. And I guess Obituary would be another one.
And the other thing too, with the influence of like things like deathcore and kind of how that gone. I mean, I've always definitely seen that coming out of Suffocation more than anyone, in terms of the brutal death metal aspect, and maybe even some Cannibal Corpse into that. If you look at something like Job for a Cowboy, I see them more or whatever, Suicide Silence or whatever, I would definitely see them more, and I know they have toured with bands like Suffocation, more so than, I would expect some other bands. And sorry, train of thought lost, so Tyler, if you want to jump back in.
Sure, no problem. Yeah, I agree with you. I think Suffocation had a huge influence on that scene, but there was like kind of a weird dovetailing of brutal death metal and technical and progressive death metal, and even in like deathcore, there were bands like, I'm going to try my best to remember names here because I'm not that conversant with the scene. I want to say it's Beneath something that had, they definitely utilized a lot of surface level elements, I suppose you could say, of technical death metal, a lot of like dissonant sweeping and chords and things like that, that became associated with the genre. That I think like when I hear a band, like for instance, a newer band that I heard, Archspire, to me kind of sits in an odd middle ground between what you might call deathcore and technical death metal and brutal death metal. And it feels like in a way that all of those scenes kind of, like I said, kind of end up intersecting at some point, and it's almost its own layer to the death metal scene.
I think that's fair. I see where you're coming from. I definitely see it. I think probably because Death was one of the first to, I mean, Human in 1991. Morbid Angel had only put out their second album, and, Blessed Are the Sick, and, think about other bands. By the time of Human, we're already making that leap into the progressive, and at the time, sort of things like Cynic and Atheist were doing. I think Shelley's right in mentioning them is maybe the real beginning of it, but there's a phenomena, I feel like, in any scene where bands, given enough time, will try to show that they've become better musicians, and for a lot of that tends to be more, especially in the realm of rock and metal-based music, more progressive rock sort of influences. And, this is everything, you compare Kill 'Em All to Injustice for All, and it's a pretty massive leap in technicality and progressive structure. And yeah, I just think you find this across the board. And again, not every band does that. Like some bands, almost like Autopsy, before they broke up, like went straight back into punk rock. Like, no, we're just going to simplify it even more. So, there's different trends, but a very, very common one, and you can finding black metal, finding death metal, finding thrash metal. And I think it's the same case with deathcore. A lot of bands probably look in the brutality of Suffocation stuff, but then wanting something more complicated. And then, of course, I think a very common trend for the last 20 years is how much Gore Guts has influenced that. So I think we're kind of tapping on that phenomenon occurring.
Well, I'd love to say it's a Hegelian dialectic in a way, and that you get the thesis, i.e. the thesis of death metal, then you get the progressive turn, which tries to, as you said, Joseph, the musicians are trying to prove their technical ability, and then you get a pushback from that. In the Hegelian dialectic, that would be a synthesis, but it doesn't really work in this analogy, but I just wanted to say the phrase, where it kind of happens with every kind of wave of a scene where you get the desire to push back and produce something primitive again. I think in terms of death metal, by about 1991, that pushback was called black metal. But you do get bands that are kind of trying to almost transcend death metal in a way, and I think Def was one example of that, where although Chuck was very interested in what was going on in the scene, he was also trying to bring the music a step up, bring it into the light of day, into the same level as some of these thrash bands. Although,
well, for Chuck, I feel like, and again, this is almost jumping ahead to the end of the time frame for the first wave of American death metal, but I think in Chuck it's almost unintentional in terms of having any kind of grander view. I think as he got older, again, the same sort of interest in being more technical and showing his musicianship improving. But as mentioned before, his interest in early heavy metal, I mean, this was all heading towards Control Denied. The last Death album was supposed to be a Control Denied album. Like, I mean, you can literally imagine the Sound of Perseverance with clean vocals, because that was supposed to be the intent. But then he decided to still make it a Death album. And, you can see that they do a cover of Judas Priest's Painkiller. I think Chuck, for a lot of people, was the first person to ever mention bands like the French heavy metal band Sortilege, and that was apparently a big influence on him. So weirdly, and a lot of people going more progressive, or some people going more punk, or, as they get older, wanting to shift things either to something they were nostalgic for or something that they feel like they were progressing towards. Chuck was sort of, I think, reverting to his nostalgia for that kind of early 80s metal.
Yeah, it's interesting because it manifests in such a different way to a band like Carcass that, you can hear that in Heartwork. You can clearly hear the sort of early 80s melodic metal, which Carcass, in their original formation, kind of existed in spite of that kind of music. That's kind of what grindcore was, and then to hear it come through on Heartwork is interesting. And then Bill Steer, he has always been a fan of classic rock, and that starts to come through on Swan Song even more, although the album was widely panned. But I think he formed a classic rock band at one point in the hiatus of Carcass, and it's interesting to just compare that to the way it manifested in a band like Def. And to some extent, you could say that is always the result of a band that releases an album that's kind of billed as returning to the roots, like something like Slaughter of the Soul as well would be an example of that, in my view, in that it kind of strips the sophistication of their first two albums way back and just sort of deals in sort of pure, just very simple sequences of very catchy melodic hooks.
Well, and not to, you always have to look at when band members change, and that was certainly the case in At the Gates.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, I think in the context of death metal, it's an interesting subject to touch upon, because I feel that in the kind of early 90s, I suppose you could say, you do have this phenomenon of, I think it's especially relevant in the context of the genre death metal, this notion that death metal bands, various death metal bands like Pestilence, to some extent Atheist, although they were kind of already doing this style, Cynic, Death, had this attitude that they wanted to prove to non-fans of the genre that death metal was a genre that should be taken seriously. Seriously in the sense of being a technically proficient genre to play, that there was competent musicianship, and that death metal musicians could perform music that was that could be sort of taken seriously or admired by people, even if they weren't necessarily fans of the genre. And you got a lot of interesting albums and experiments out of that period of death metal.
Well, I want to just zoom in on Atheist for a second, actually, while we're on this. Not just because they are one of my favorite bands out of this scene, but I think they are a really interesting case study in this progressive element because, as I've already mentioned, they were very early to it. They obviously formed in the mid 80s as Ravage and then changed their name to Atheist, but they were already writing the material that would find its way onto Piece of Time by 87, 88. And they would say, at the time when they would play gigs and stuff on death metal bills, the response was lackluster at best, and they'd be heckled quite a lot. But by the time that obviously their career was kind of marred by a tragedy, and that their bassist Roger Patterson died in that horrific accident, and also label troubles and sort of replacing Patterson himself. Elements, when it did come out in '93, it was an album that they didn't really want to release, but they were contractually obliged to. And the subtext of that, as well as it was, they had to take it away from Morrisound and produce it somewhere else. And sort of out of that, you do get Piece of Time and Unquestionable Presence, but they were almost released too soon. They were literally the definition of being ahead of their time. And once the death metal community was ready to receive progressive death metal in say how it was articulated by Cynic on Focus or Death on their early 90s albums, Atheist had already had to sort of break up for various extra musical reasons. But they did lay the groundwork for that, but they were insanely unappreciated at the time. It wasn't that they were trying to prove themselves to an audience, it's the fact that the audience just wasn't quite ready to listen. Or is that a bit too simplistic of you?
No, I think that's accurate. I mean, I very much appreciate Atheist out of that whole sort of cadre of bands for that reason. They were playing the music that they wanted to play. I don't think that there was a chip on their shoulder, so to speak, about people not taking death metal seriously and thinking that it was simplistic, knuckleheaded noise. Whereas I do think that did have at least somewhat of a presence in some of the early 90s progressive death metal albums. But that's not to undermine those albums either, actually. It's an unpopular opinion, but I don't think Spheres by Pestilence is that bad. I don't think it's anywhere near as good as Consuming Impulse, but I don't think it's that bad. But yeah, Atheist, I think, was really, you can hear how they are playing something that truly is an expression of the kind of music that they enjoy. And I think that's why, in my opinion, an album like Unquestionable Presence stands worlds apart from albums like Focus or even Human.
I mean, you're definitely, I think, accurate in portraying them as sort of like the weird red-headed stepchild of death metal, at least how the death metal scene appreciated them in the late 80s, early 90s. And I think it's no surprise that those guys, a lot of them, when the band kind of disbanded, just kind of went in different directions. And that's not, a lone story. There's a lot of bands you can kind of think about that never really got their due back in the day, and then kind of thought, well, that was a big waste. And then sometime in the 2000s to early 2010s, all of a sudden, something like a cult following or even bigger kind of develops, and they go, "Oh crap, people actually do care about what we did." And I think Atheist is certainly an example of that, where very, looking back, like if you were to take a time machine and go, "Oh, Atheist is one of the greatest, Florida death metal bands," you would be tomatoes thrown your way. That kind of appreciation for them fitting into the scene didn't happen until later. But historically, we can look at them and see the influence and say it's absolutely deserved that they're highly mentioned.
Yeah, they're the Van Gogh of Florida death metal. Yeah, so just before we move on from the progressive element, I've mentioned Nocturnus in that category as well. Obviously, Mike Browning, founding member, involved in Morbid Angel in the early days. They're an odd one in this kind of oeuvre because the guitar work is very technical, and some of the songs on the key are, I mean, they're not complex by today's standards, but they probably were when it was released. I think it was 1990 or whatever. But they they had similar problems in terms of the lineup, and the band weren't really happy with Mike Browning's ability, and there was lots of shuffling around between the key and thresholds and stuff. But I never think they got away from, even at the time, being considered like a novelty band in that they had a full-time keyboard player or whatever. Do you think, I know they've kind of undergone a reappraisal recently, and Tyler and I discussed Nocturnus AD's album released this year. But do they ever get away from being a novelty band, or is there something more to them in terms of them blazing a trail in a way, maybe not comparable to Atheist, but equally kind of noteworthy?
I mean, I definitely think they're a band that's become a cult following and heroes to people who like music that's a bit off kilter, not even necessarily progressive, but just sort of has enjoyment of the weird, almost in like the Lovecraftian terms, that like things slightly being off. So they've always kind of been like the weirdo band that weirdo fans.
I enjoy it for that intersection of, like, because you can hear the takes on the key and how, yeah, some of them just, you wouldn't really hear them on a modern record in terms of the sloppy playing and stuff. But that's one of the things I do appreciate. It kind of bridges that gap between trying to be quite sophisticated, but also the playing is quite feral at times. A little bit like how you can enjoy Morbid Visions, because it's a sloppy as fuck album, but that's part of its appeal, is the fact that it is just, not to sound corny, but it's from the heart.
Oh no, I mean, and I always enjoy that stuff that sometimes comes across as amateurish, but has the emotional involvement is 100%. Like, I always use that when defending, which is weird because some people idolize that album so much and then some don't, but like something like Core Throne's clean vocals, like, to me, it's, you have them in front of any professional vocalist or vocal coach and they'll probably critique till the sun goes down. But I also feel like he's, when he was probably singing in the studio, like everything out of his gut was coming out.
Well, yeah, I remember watching an interview with the guy from Primordial when he was in Twilight of the Gods with the Bathory cover band, and because he is a competent vocalist, he's got some chops, and he was saying how, like, you can tell Quorthon didn't really know what he was doing because he writes too many words in each stanza. You're not quite sure which note is supposed to fall where, and he's kind of trying to basically transcribe what Quorthon did for someone that, actually has kind of more of a musical an ear for, like, where the notes should fall and stuff. It's quite interesting because he wasn't critical. He's like, obviously Bathory is one of my all-time favorite bands, and this is why I'm in Bathory cover band. But at the same time, trying to make sense of what Quorthon was doing from the recordings is nigh on impossible. Yeah. So I do also want to touch on some of the bands that kind of traveled to Florida, particularly for the Morrisound, just, to get the Morrisound treatment, as it were. And we've mentioned Pestilence, And just as a little side note, I re-listened to Spheres lately, and actually that album holds up. Give it a listen at some point, because yeah, it is abrasive as fuck, but as a sort of another weird, oddball, semi-early progressive death metal effort, it's an interesting one. But prior to that, obviously, Testimony of the Ancients, they recorded at Morris Sound. Gorguts, Considered Dead, done at Morris Sound. Suffocation. You have a whole bunch of bands, and the thing they have in common is a deal with Roadrunner, artwork painted by Dan Seagrave, and production by Scott Burns. And this is, I think, it was around 1991. And again, in the book, Scott Burns kind of, you can sense in some of the interviews in the book that he's a bit bitter about the fact that it was becoming a bit of a production line at one point, where it was like, deal with Roadrunner, artwork by the same guy, production by the same guy, blah 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 blah. But a lot of classic albums came out of it, and it sort of attracted the likes of Napalm Death, who did Harmony Corruption when they were kind of moving in a death metal direction. And the amusing thing reading about the Harmony Corruption sessions is everybody got on, except for the drummer Mick Harris, who was, again, a really feral drummer who was used to kind of just blasting his way through stuff. And one of the chief appeals of an album like Scum is the fact that it is sloppy as fuck in a lot of ways. Not so much From Enslavement to Obliteration, although it is another archetypical grindcore album, but Napalm Death were kind of encouraged to professionalize themselves at this point. They had a slightly new lineup, new vocalist, new guitarist, and everything, and they went to Morris Sound, and Scott Burns wasn't the producer to kind of let a duff take sit. He would always push people to kind of do more, and apparently it drove Mick Harris crazy. But for me, I've always found Harmony Corruption slightly flat on the production side, maybe because Napalm Death weren't quite ready for like a polished sound. But yeah, you also have bands like Sepultura, who, for Beneath the Remains, actually Scott Burns flew out to Brazil to produce that album. And that along with Slowly We Rot and Leprosy was like the albums that keep coming up with all of these interviews with these other bands in this book, in terms of like the production that all of these bands wanted. Is they hadn't heard like the snare sound so powerful before they heard Beneath the Remains, and the really kind of powerful energy that exists on Slowly We Rot. I know that this is only tangentially related to Florida, but I wanted to get Tyler's take on particularly Beneath the Remains, because you're such a fan of Morbid Visions, but I think Beneath the Remains is my favorite Sepultura album, but it almost feels like talking about a different band, because the leaps and bounds they've done between that and Schizophrenia is something to behold. But for me, Beneath the Remains is almost like the ultimate in sort of late thrash sophistication. I'm interested to get your take on what you make of that album.
It is my second favorite Sepultura album, and it's incredible. I love Beneath the Remains. Schizophrenia, to me, I'm sorry to everyone who likes this album, but that album puts me to sleep. It's kind of boring. It sounds almost like a meeting place between German thrash metal and Metallica, with some death metal influences still in there, obviously, but it really is kind of confused. I think they were looking for a synthesis that they didn't quite achieve on that album, that they did achieve on Beneath the Remains. And Beneath the Remains is awesome. It's a ripping, energy-driven, powerful testament to Slayer and also other thrash metal bands like Metallica, for instance, style of music. And I love it. Do I listen to it as much as Morbid Visions? No, but I love that album. It's
you don't listen to anything as much as Morbid Visions, so.
No, maybe Iljon comes close, but.
Oh yeah, fair enough. Yeah, the Sepultura one's interesting because after that they did come to Morris Sound to do Arise, which was arguably like their breakthrough album, and this is where like this is the interesting canary in the coal mine for almost like the death of death metal in the iteration that we're talking about, because yeah, it was produced by Scott Burns, but the execs from Roadrunner apparently had real problems with particularly the snare sound. For some reason, Scott Burns could not get a snare sound that satisfied the guys from Roadrunner, and they took it away from him for it to be finished elsewhere. And then obviously for Chaos AD, they never came back to Morris Sound after that. But it was kind of that, narratively speaking, it was Sepultura outgrowing not just Morrisound and Florida, but death metal in general, which was like Arise is the weird transitional album where you do have elements of Beneath the Remains, but you can clearly hear, with hindsight, you can clearly hear elements of Chaos AD and kind of the direction that they would take. But you don't need me to tell you, Sepultura's sound after that kind of defined that element of metal in a way, the groove-based proto new metal thing, along with bands like Pantera and kind of what Metallica were doing on the Black album. Joseph, do you have any thoughts on Arise, but also like that idea of like certain bands just maybe outgrowing death metal in a way?
I mean, Sepultura is a very interesting one in terms of how a band evolves. They took some directions. It's hard to say. I feel like they took so many different twists. Like, usually bands take one particular turn. Sepultura took like 3 of them. Heck, even after the max stage, you could say like 4 or 5. I would agree. Beneath the Remains is a fantastic album. Sepultura is a pretty near and dear band to me, although weirdly enough, Arise is maybe my favorite, but partially that's a bias that it was my first Sepultura album. So there's a particular individual aspect to that. The one thing I always remember that was funny was like, I think people were asked later, like, "Oh, you look so cool in those promo photos for that with the leather jackets and everything. How come you don't wear that?" And they're like, "Because in Morrisound, the AC was turned all the way the fuck up. Like, we don't normally wear leather jackets in Brazil or anywhere else, but we had to there because it was so goddamn cold." Which, for a band from Brazil, that makes sense. I was this year, first time I was, it wasn't even that late. I think in the year, it was April. I was in Mexico, and I couldn't believe how fucking hot it was. I mean, it was the Yucatan, but so I can just imagine Sao Paulo. Sepultura, it certainly, I think, that helped establish, along with the death metal, or early Morbid Angel, early Death, and everyone going to Morrisound. I think Sepultura definitely helped be aware to bands and labels that Scott Burns and the Morrison brothers, that they were something worth going to, that they could produce something, literally produce and mix and master albums of a particular quality and content.
Yeah, it's interesting how that quickly becomes like lethargy. So you have those albums maybe released in '89 that everyone like latches onto, and everyone says, "Oh, we've got to get the Morrisound treatment." But even just a couple of years later, I mentioned like the production line thing, it becomes the signature where even Scott Burns himself sounds like he's kind of almost sick of it in a way. Where he never mentions particularly which bands he's talking about, but it's always just they were looking for me to paper over the cracks in a way. And you have like another Roadrunner band that comes down or whatever, and they want that treatment to make them sound good. He never names any names because he's forever the professional. But we've talked about some of the big hitters, I guess, but there are those bands that I still think are really good, but they end up sounding generic by virtue of being recorded at Morrisound. I'm thinking particularly of bands like Demolition Hammer, their first album, because they were a different prospect. They were kind of more of a pure thrash band, but they get the Scott Burns treatment on their debut, and it kind of comes off sounding a little bit too similar to maybe Cause of Death or something like that, in my opinion. And it's that's when it started to become a little bit of a production line, everything sort of sounding the same, and where I could kind of sympathize with people in Norway, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned yeah, it's fun to bring these philosophical ideas, but the dialect, the Hegelian dialect, you can almost call it sort of like physics, for every action there is a reaction. That, once I mean, people talk about death metal came out of thrash metal starting to become a little bit formulaic. I feel like was one thing that influenced death metal to do what it did. And then once death metal started doing that, you had maybe some B-tier bands generally sounding a bit too much alike. People were like, "Oh, we need to do something different. This is just feels too same thing over and over again."
And in turn, like thrash came out of partly in a response to sort of like early glam metal and hair metal or whatever. Like, keeps going back.
Well, and then also, thrash is very much, classic metal heads who also really liked hardcore punk and were like, I want the intensity of like a Black Flag show, but I want to have the melody of Iron Maiden.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. I mean, it's two things we've talked about on this podcast on a number of occasions or at least I know that I've brought up, is the standardization of the format, where because the idea of this is what death metal or thrash metal or heavy metal sounds like, the bar for entry becomes lowered, because once the format is standardized, it becomes easy to imitate. And that's where you get an oversaturation of the market with a large number of sound-alikes. And then at that point, the people who are actually creative are drowned out by the sea of imitators they're surrounded by, and they either exit or they're unnoticed. And then usually in metal, throughout most of its history, you have a reaction to that. And then the other thing that I know I've brought up before is the odd similarities in the early scenes of heavy metal subgenres. Like if you go back to the early days of the new wave of British heavy metal that eventually, in some ways, kind of if I can do words, kind of transformed into glam metal. You have a sort of a DIY ethos with hand-drawn cover art, demos recorded on tapes by the bands themselves, being traded by word of mouth or by mail. People kind of putting together the scene themselves, and you see the same thing in the early days of thrash metal. And then you see the same thing in the early days of death metal and the same thing in the early days of black metal. So in some ways, it's like these subgenres were a reaction to what came before them, but also a sort of continuation of what the genre they are reacting to was doing in its infancy. It's almost like an odd parallel case of evolution and maintaining of orthodoxy. And to kind of bring that back around to talking about Florida death metal, which a big topic with Florida death metal is its foundation to the death metal scene as a whole, is black metal's reaction to death metal, I think in a way seems like a wholesale rejection of it. But I really feel, based on direct statements from black metal musicians themselves, and even just similarities aesthetically, that the black metal musicians were almost, in a sense, fans of or inspired by the very early days of death metal when it had that DIY ethos.
Oh, absolutely.
They actually enjoyed that. What they were reacting to was, as I kind of said before, death metal after the format became standardized.
I think one thing that's interesting, again, we probably shouldn't focus too much on black metal in this episode, but I do find it interesting. We talk about sort of like how death metal kind of hit this weird, I think. Well, the one thing we haven't talked about is sort of the very brief period where major label attention was given to death metal. And we should probably talk about like death metal in terms of popularity and the idea of it being commercial kind of
We haven't
the
talked
highest
about Ace
peak.
Ventura yet.
Well, that and Columbia and Giant Records.
Yeah, absolutely.
And all of
Oh
all
yeah,
that
that's
jazz.
a
I mean,
yeah, and it bears particular relevance to this topic
yeah.
too.
But the one
Yeah,
thing,
no, go for it.
the one thing I wanted to mention though is that after that era ended and death metal kind of went into the woods, the thing with death metal was sort of like the critique was that like a lot of the bands were kind of sticking too close to that formula, and maybe there were certain like subgenres. You talk about brutal death metal and technical death metal, but like I think a critique was that a lot of these bands just weren't that innovative anymore. And weirdly, in black metal, it feels like after whatever date you want to give it for that peak of the '90s scene. I always think of it. It's interesting. There's the not Metal Evolution, but the Metal Headbangers Journey interview, the infamous one where he interviews Necrobutcher, and Necrobutcher tells him to fuck off, because he says something along the lines of like black metal's going down, or something's happened to black metal, and then they revisit the interview later, and he later says, I think I worded that wrong. I think I wanted to say that black metal had fractured by the late '90s. And is kind of the case, where unlike death metal, black metal just sort of every classic black metal band went in very different directions, often pretty far away from the core, from the formula, but to the point where a lot of people looked at that and thought, well, where's the black metal Navy?
Yeah, I think it is interesting because I think black metal, we can sort of play down the extracurricular activities or the public pronouncements of particularly the Norwegian scene at the time, but it did kind of have quite a lasting influence over the music itself, in that it was so oppositional at its core that it was almost inherently going to be experimental. And I think that's where it differs from death metal specifically, because there have been death metal bands that have gone in a very experimental direction. We mentioned Gorguts earlier being a good example of that. But a lot of death metal bands, they either petered out, went far more kind of simple and traditional, or kind of just kept doing the same thing. I think Cannibal Corpse is probably an example of that. Kind of they found their niche and just keep on going, and have garnered an audience for that. Whereas with black metal, they were so kind of, they were living it to such an extent that they kind of were almost destined to take it in experimental directions. But I think also that the hidden influence there is, again, someone like Euronymous, who did have a wide pool of influences that he was drawing on outside of not just black metal, but outside of metal in general. And Fenriz has kind of talked about this in terms of like the Berlin School of Ambient being a big influence, and he has his Neptune Towers side project and things like that kind of taking over. And then you look at all of the classic Norwegian bands, like we on this podcast, not necessarily yourself, Joseph, but myself and Tyler, we don't necessarily appreciate all of the directions that they've taken over the years, but you can't say that the direction that Immortal took is anything like the direction that the members of Emperor took after Emperor disbanded, or anything like what Enslaved did, or Satyricon, and so on. Like any of those sort of formative Norwegian acts, in the same way that maybe like a Deicide, a Cannibal Corpse, or a Suffocation have kind of stuck to their guns one way or another, in various different guises, which I think it does come back to that just ultra oppositional attitude that was kind of baked into the Norwegian scene from day one.
It could also do in part with some of the characteristics of Scandinavia that, and again, don't want to get into too much, but just the whole sort of, there is very much a conformist sort of culture there, in terms of not sticking out, not having your head pop out, and familiarizing myself with Scandinavian culture, you definitely notice it. And so that's a sort of rebelling in comparison to a lot of American bands, where we do have this sort of individualism baked into our culture. So there's definitely some difference to that. the other thing just being, I would compare the black metal scene in terms of how it fractured into so many ways, very comparable to, I feel like, post-punk in the UK, where all these punk bands either shifted themselves, like the Damned, or started other bands like, you know, Linden going from Sex Pistols to Pill. And there's so many examples where just things just went so many different directions with what was done with what was essentially the root of punk rock. And death metal, yeah, that I think has had a more conservative lean where, again, not all of it. There absolutely been progressive bands and bands doing very odd and avant-garde and weird stuff, but at least I would say 50% of the scene has kind of done that stick to your guns, do what we do well attitude.
Well, I would say there's a weird pocket in the late 90s where you do get some really odd death metal albums, but the majority of them come from scenes that aren't Sweden or Tampa or New York and California. There's the opening up of Eastern Europe is a really good example of this. There's some really weird bands from Romania, Ultimatum and Diamos, the two that I've come across recently that were reissued by, I think it was Loud Rage Music. Both releases in like the late 90s. But I would say, you know, albums like Incantation's Diabolical Conquest, Gorguts Obscura that we've already mentioned, and a handful of others that are just oddball death metal, not very palatable in terms of just aesthetically. They're quite unlistenable in a lot of ways, but it is this odd pocket of like experimental death metal. But you're absolutely right to say it's nowhere near to the extent that black metal fractured, and yeah, definitely not anywhere near to the extent that something like post-punk fractured. I think that's quite a good analogy to draw under very different circumstances. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Like the leap from something like Joy Division to New Order, things like that, is a really good kind of analogy for what happened to black metal. And some of them left black metal entirely. You obviously had the sort of formation of dungeon synth with bands like Iljan and Burzum, and even like the dude from Satyricon doing a dungeon synth album as well, where they just kind of gave up, you know, put their guitars down. And yeah, you don't really get something comparable in thrash or death metal. Tyler, did you want to come in on that? Sorry.
No problem. Yeah, to touch back on Joseph's point originally, and I think this applies to death metal too, especially in regards to what you were saying, Shelley, with some of the albums that were coming out in the late 90s and still somewhat happen today. I think that while experimentation considered in and of itself is good, and doing things that are unexpected is good, I think that's partly why many fans of metal like myself appreciate things like Norwegian black metal, is because of the unexpected aspects of its music. It's not predictable. The perennial problem of experimental music proper, you know, an album trying to be like expressly trying to be experimental, is that it's usually a reaction to use this phrase again like a broken record, the standardization of the format. And the issue with that is that in reacting to that standardized format, even though you're doing something experimental, your definition of experimental is formed by that standardized format. So I think that's why a lot of those kind of experimental directions can leave people feeling like something has been lost, as Joseph was saying when people were asking, well, where's the black metal in this? I think that's kind of the explanation behind that feeling, is that, you know, even though people want something to be noticeable above the sea of imitators, as I put it earlier, a sort of explicitly experimental album is in a way defined by that sea of imitators.
I mean, certainly I think Kark is probably an example of that. I feel like they mentioned that they felt like the glut of underground grindcore was just ripping them off. So they felt like, okay, let's do something different.
Right, and then their notion of different becomes what's different than what we were doing before all of these bands imitating us are doing, which kind of, in a sense, limits your horizon of what different can be, you know, because now part of your notion of different categorically excludes anything that sounds like what you're trying to differentiate yourself from.
Yeah, I mean, kind of. Just keep on referencing Hegel. Keeps on kind of going to the dialectic. It's constantly that push and pull, and that your opposition is always influenced. Your opposition to something is always influenced by the ones agitating you.
So I have in my notes, I don't want to mention them in the same sentence as B tier, but bands like Malevolent Creation and Monstrosity, who form part of the creation myth of Florida death metal in a lot of ways, but never get mentioned in the same breath as the likes of Deicide or Morbid Angel or Death. But for me, going back over both bands' first two albums, um, it's kind of bridges the experience that we've kind of been discussing, in that they both sound very, very typical, but they also sound really, really good at being typical. Particularly Monstrosity's second album, Millennium, which is a very, very technical album. Again, maybe not by today's standards, but by the standards of the mid-90s when it was released, I think it does fall into that bracket of death metal trying to overcome its limitations. But because it's sort of serviced again by quite exhausted Scott Burns by this point, it sounds maybe a little bit flat and a little bit generic. But they kind of get lumped into that sort of B tier, not quite as good as Suffocation, not quite as good as some of the other bands at the time, but they're much better than I think some of the other bands that we're referencing that were kind of followers, not leaders.
I mean, the narrative parallel of Monstrosity into Cannibal Corpse, because of course, after that Millennium, Corpse Grinder moves over to the Cannibal Corpse. I feel is comparable to in the UK with I think it was Benediction in terms of Barney then becoming the Napalm Death vocalist.
I think Barney had only done one album with Benediction by that point, but yeah, I could see, because a vocal shift. I think, well, maybe I don't even know if this works, but I think Carl Willett's leaving Bolt Thrower temporarily, and the other guy from Benediction taking over might be more comparable, just because after Mercenary, Carl Willetts had enough, but he was kind of such an integral part of Bolt Thrower.
Although, I mean, that's only one Bolt Thrower album where the vocalist changed.
Yeah, true.
The most noticeable, it's a case of like a band kind of known more so in the wider scene because the original vocalist or the early day vocalist then moved to a much bigger band.
So I have two more things in my notes to discuss. One is Terrorizer, but I think we've already discussed that on a tier list, and it takes us right back to 1989. Although we do kind of need to mention it because the photo of Scott Burns that's on the back of that album is the one that Euronymous used on the famous No Mosh, No Core, No Fun propaganda. And I know it's probably Tyler's second favorite album, is it?
What, World Downfall?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. It probably is my second most listened to album, I think. Yeah.
Fair enough. And that's another Scott Burns classic, and I find that an interesting one just because you have obviously the members of Morbid Angel and stuff, but playing. I don't want to call it primitive because I don't think it's a primitive album, but they are playing sort of very by the numbers grindcore, and I didn't realize this until I re-listened to it. And again, I read Scott Burns' interview on it, but there's no guitar solos on that album either. It's just straight up grindcore, which I do like about it, but I also it misses the sloppiness of an album like Scum or Reeker Putrefaction. That is kind of what I appreciate about grindcore, but yeah, I understand why you love it so much, Tyler.
It has awesome riffs.
That's all you need. And I did see Terrorizer at Brutal Assault a few weeks ago, and they were exceptional, so I can't fault them for that. And it was bakingly hot in the Czech Republic August. But the other thing that I have in my notes is kind of like bringing us maybe not full circle, but back to this conversation about where do you take death metal is like the next generation of death metal, particularly from this part of the world. And I've got Hate Eternal written there. Now, I'm not that familiar with Hate Eternal, other than I know that Jason mentions them quite frequently, with him being familiar with Eric Rutan and his involvement in various other death metal bands and stuff. But they are, you know, the kind of the typical way that you would advance death metal in terms of just trying to take it in quite a technical direction, but maybe just not doing it quite as good as, say, a band like Nile, who are another example that I forgot to mention in that late 90s oeuvre of a band really trying to build on the foundations of like death metal in its heyday without betraying the ethos of death metal, for want of a better word, but also kind of succeeding and failing all at once, in that you can kind of, for instance, Niall's first album, you can absolutely appreciate what they're trying to do, but it's also like a beautiful cacophony of nonsense in a lot of ways, and I absolutely love listening to it. But it doesn't make sense in the way that an album like Effigy of the Forgotten or Unquestionable Presence makes sense. Just that, any thoughts on like that next generation of technical death metal? I guess you could put someone like Deeds of Flesh in there as well. I know we're sort of moving beyond Florida a little bit here, but because these are building on like the Florida bands, I think it's kind of relevant to discuss it as like the legacy of Tampa in its heyday.
Well, certainly certainly I see Nile as a band, not necessarily in every musical sense, but a band very much tethered and to Morbid Angel. Like, I think on a personal level, those bands got along together. I think that might have to do in part from, because didn't Morbid Angel for a while like live in South Carolina? I feel like that was a thing.
Yeah, I think possibly they did. Yeah,
yeah, and the interesting thing, the Nile guys tend actually a little bit older, and really kind of would have fit with the early '90s scene. But one reason or another, the band really didn't hit its stride till the late '90s. I personally enjoy the first 4 albums from them quite a bit. After that, I feel like it kind of got lost. But yeah, I certainly see them as one of the better prospects that took the Florida scene, the American scene, and kind of kept it going. Other ones that I'm less interested in, but certainly going to like Tyler, what mentioned earlier about the roots of what would become like deathcore and everything, like a band like Dying Fetus, I feel like, developed at that same time and became a big influence on that, kind of seeing the more hardcore punk kind of intermixing with death metal. Yeah, that's kind of how I look at it. And Nile, though, definitely being one associated with Morbid Angel.
Yeah, definitely. Tyler, any thoughts on like the legacy of Florida in particular, but yeah, that heyday of death metal, and anyone that maybe carried the torch from the late '90s through to the early 2010s when all of these bands started reforming anyway?
The legacy of Florida is a checkered one, my friend. You know, death, I think, almost is something that stands apart from the legacy of Floridian death metal. Obviously, it was a major part of it, but we already went into detail about its influence on progressive metal. But when we're talking about Florida death metal proper, brought up Hate Eternal and Nile and Deeds of Flesh. I think that in a large way, that is at least in part the legacy of Floridian death metal. Those bands were deeply influenced by groups like Malevolent Creation and Cannibal Corpse and Massacre and Autopsy and Death and Morbid Angel and Deicide. Hate Eternal explicitly so in several ways, both from having an obvious later Morbid Angel influence on their sound, featuring a member of Morbid Angel, at least at one point, and also featuring a member of Suffocation. Doug Cerrito, I think, played guitar on their debut album, if I remember correctly. So you definitely see an influence there. That would be a legacy that I myself personally am not so fond of. I find a lot of that vein of death metal somewhat tired and boring, Deeds of Flesh being a notable exception. And the first Hate Eternal album is all right, but it's not something I ever reach for. Um, but you also have, and this is an interesting one, the legacy of Floridian death metal in the form of a band like Angel Corpse, who actually relocated to Florida um, from Kansas City, Missouri, and were obviously deeply influenced by a group like Morbid Angel in particular. And then they themselves arguably were one of the major foundational bands to a huge portion of the kind of some of the deepest elements of the underground death and black metal scene today, what we would call perhaps loosely the bestial, raw death and black metal / war metal scene. Um, so in that sense, you could say that as much as that scene is also influenced by black metal, both first wave and second wave, and groups like Blasphemy, um, that scene itself, because it also had a huge impact from from a group like Angel Corpse, is itself a kind of legacy of the Florida death metal scene.
Well, yeah, I think Angel Corpse, a couple of their albums were produced by one of the Morris brothers, if I'm not mistaken. But I mean, yeah, just on that point of sort of, I guess what you're always pointing to, Tyler, is bringing the evil back into death metal. By evil, I mean sort of the atmosphere that you have on an album like Seven Churches or whatever. And I always think Deicide are a really interesting prospect in that regard. And I keep wanting to do a focus episode on them because I think they're interesting enough, but I really only like at the most 3 albums by them, and I don't think there's enough going for it after that. But I think they are a fascinating like blip in not just the Florida death metal scene, but just in general the classic era of death metal, in that they bridge the gap between war metal, black metal, and death metal in a lot of ways, just bringing in this violently occultist kind of aspect to what they do, but dragging it into what is kind of, the what Euronymous lamented as tracksuit wearing death metal scene in a lot of ways. And they do bridge that gap. And I think Morbid Angel, to maybe a slightly lesser extent, but in a similar way, although I know Morbid Angel were, particularly their debut, was one of the few albums that the black metal scene respected, as I think you mentioned on one of the other episodes. Yeah, so the other thing that I believe we did need to touch on that we haven't done is the prevalence of the major label kind of encroachments onto death metal, particularly with Morbid Angel. By the time they released Covenant, I believe they were the first band to have signed with a major label. I've already mentioned the fact that Roadrunner were kind of a thorn in Scott Burns' side in terms of sending a lot of bands down to him and bringing a lot of business his way, but also bringing a lot of pressure and kind of turning it into a bit of a production line. But by the time that Morbid Angel released Covenant, which was 1993, major labels were getting very interested in death metal. And we also mentioned the fact that, Ace Ventura featured Cannibal Corpse, which I believe was 1994, which was kind of, for me, it's always just one of these cultural watershed moments where it's like a big Hollywood blockbuster features Cannibal Corpse, and it's the beginning of the end, not just because, it's popular and everyone likes it. It's more just, it has become a novelty act. It's become the same thing that Kiss or Ozzy Osbourne came before them as well. But yeah, Joseph, what are your thoughts on like the major label influence on like death metal, but particularly Florida death metal at this time?
Yeah, I mean, we could mention with some of the British bands, but yeah, I think the big one with the Florida death metal bands in terms of the major label focus was certainly Morbid Angel, with Covenant and Domination both being released on Giant, which was an imprint of Warner Brothers. So you had big money kind of put behind that. It's interesting because it feels like, the big label honchos and whatever. I mean, the funny thing is usually most of those guys, I feel like, relied on the younger scouts and stuff are like, oh, what do we put our money behind? And these guys going, oh, well, grunge was so big. What's the next thing that there's like an underground, like teenage, cult following? And somehow someone found death metal and was like, let's put money behind this. And then after 2 years, they were like, yeah, this is not bringing the numbers we want. Like, clearly it maybe doubled the size of the scene, but like to get their return on investment, they needed to get like, for whatever reason they thought like short of Nirvana type explosion would happen. Just wasn't the return on investment they were looking for. I think like a lot of times you can kind of compare it later to how of all companies Scion started investing in the metal scene. I think the metal scene was been able to take full advantage of it and benefit of it in terms of getting this wider exposure, so that kids in the Midwest or random places suddenly got to see death metal. The fact that Morbid Angel music videos and Death's Philosopher were on MTV, late at night, like maybe at 1 or 2 in the morning, but still, that had a big impact. I certainly...
When Morbid Angel were on an episode of Beavis and Butthead, I seem to remember. I think that was another watershed similar to that. Like,
yeah, Beavis and Butthead making fun of the clean vocals on God of Emptiness. Whoa.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that Death was also on Beavis and Butthead.
Yeah, they did Philosopher. Yeah. They're like, it's that weird chick in the red suit. What's going on with her?
Yeah, like I remember Beavis having a thing where he was talking about ordering Taco Bell or something, and death metal vocals like, "Can I get 2 tacos? Taco!"
Yeah. I mean that in itself, the major label, and I guess we could almost do a whole episode on this in terms of like the '90s semi-mainstream flirtation with extreme metal, and certainly that was a few extreme bands and certain death metal bands showing up on stuff like Beavis and Butthead, showing up on Headbangers Ball, actually, instead of just showing like Cinderella and Motley Crue videos, starting to show a little bit of death metal. And I think for sure, like you talk to people who got exposed to that probably between like 92 and 96, that was how they found out about this music.
Yeah, and I remember reading like Obituaries The End Complete. I think Roadrunner thought it was like a good candidate for the first death metal album that could make 6 figures in terms of sales, and that was a huge deal at the time, and turned out to be quite a flat album in terms of its quality, but I think it did make those kind of numbers on its initial release. And yeah, absolutely. Around that time, a lot of bands were featured on Headbangers Ball, and yeah, it's this weird intersection where music quite that extreme and underground was suddenly making numbers, but none of the bands themselves were kind of seeing any of the money. And I guess that's kind of the same old tale in the music industry towards ever thus. But it is an interesting cultural moment in the sort of mainstream and the underground overlapping. And I've mentioned it before, Napalm Death are a really interesting candidate for this, because long before they became an internet meme, they were a TV meme. Like they appeared on like BBC TV, kids TV programs. The guy from Jeff Walker from Carcass appeared on an episode of Red Dwarf, which was a primetime British sitcom. And Napalm Death appeared on Chris Evans' show. I can't remember what it's called now. It was some kind of Top of the Pops-esque show where he had live bands playing or whatever, and he had Napalm Death on there, although he kept calling them thrash metal when he introduced them, which is disappointing. But again, Saturday night, prime time, Napalm Death in the mid-90s, which is just bizarre to think of. At the time, now Napalm Death are kind of like a household name, especially in the UK. Like, they play Glastonbury, and even people well outside of metal have at least heard the name. But yeah, at the time it was a very kind of strange little cultural kind of moment.
And along with that, and it's kind of weird how all these things occurred, but even outside of like entertainment media, there were events. Albert Murrian from Decibel often compares sort of that mainstream success or mainstream visibility of like Napalm Death, thanks to the BBC and obviously John Peel at first taking a latch to them, but then like
Yeah.
these TV programs, like you mentioned, where they were kind of played for as a joke, but that actually got a lot of people to check them out. And then Cannibal Corpse in Florida, with not only the Ace Ventura inclusion, but like perhaps even bigger than that, was the fact that Bob Dole called them out as a degenerate factor in society, along with Two Live Crew. And listeners probably not remembering, but Bob Dole was the Republican presidential candidate. So that was back in, what was that, 96? So that was a big deal, that kind of happened.
That is a big deal, actually. Yeah.
Bob Dole was a Republican presidential candidate. That's awful. Yeah, I mean the mainstream sort of recognition of extreme metal during that brief period was really interesting. I mean, I didn't experience it firsthand, being the age that I am, but I believe it's in the book Choosing Death: The Improbable History of Death Metal and Grindcore, that they have a section that covers that, and it was really fascinating for me. They were mainly focusing on, I think, Godflesh, Napalm Death, Entombed, and Morbid Angel, and perhaps Carcass. But talking about what Joseph mentioned with major record labels, says, kind of like miscalculatingly throwing their weight behind these bands, thinking that this was going to be the next revolution in rebellious teenager music, and then somewhat quickly finding out that they were mistaken about that. But yeah, it resulted in some. It's really interesting that the genre got that much spotlight for being, with how extreme its beginnings were, and it also resulted in some really amusing anecdotes, like the cover art for Wolverine Blues and how the band didn't want it to have anything to do with the X-Men character, but because they were on a major record label, the record label decided it knew better. Or maybe not knew better, but was just absolutely clueless. So yeah, really interesting time in death metal history.
The shoot, I was gonna Shelley, continue. I'll interrupt you when I remember.
Oh, well, I was going to move the topic on. So earlier on, I mentioned how Arise, Sepultura's Arise was taken off Scott Burns because Roadrunner were not happy with the snare sound. And for whatever reason, Sepultura, sort of agreed with him and decided to take the project away, and they took Chaos AD, the next album, away from Scott Burns as well, and sort of that was the example of how death metal, or Sepultura, sorry, outgrew death metal, and in particular Morrisound as well. But I believe, Joseph, you have some other comments around the drum sound at Morrisound. Did you want to expand on that?
I do. Just to quickly end the previous discussion, because now the train of thought returned to me.
Okay.
Two things I was going to mention: that mainstream flirtation with more extreme types of music. I was watching which, regardless of how you feel about the band, I highly recommend it as a work of documentary work. The documentary about Gwar that came out a year or two ago was really fascinating. But there's a part of it where, at a point, Warner Brothers approached Metal Blade about doing distribution for them, which would have been a big deal. And surprisingly, Warner Brothers didn't have too many notes about, oh, you need to change this with this band, or you need to change that with this band. And I think, what's his name? The guy in charge of Metal Blade, forgetting his name. But he said that even with Cannibal Corpse, there wasn't surprisingly many notes about, oh, they need to do this, or they can't have the lyrics like this. But they did make a sticking point about a Gwar song that had something to do with dead babies or something like that, which is funny because Cannibal has a song like that. Maybe they just didn't bother checking the Cannibal lyrics, but the Metal Blade Honcho went, we could have this deal if you change the lyrics on that song, until Guar said, but I'm not going to make you. It's your decision whether you want to do that or not. And Guar decided not to change it, so the Metal Blade decided not to do the deal with Warner Brothers.
Wow. Okay.
Which I always thought was just one of the coolest thing for a label owner to turn down such a huge economic opportunity due to integrity and wanting to keep that band as a working relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That's actually very admirable. As much as I don't like a lot of what Metal Blade is released, I really give them props for doing that.
Yeah. No, I can't for the life of me remember his name, but I saw him at the last Psycho Vegas. He was hanging out there at one of the near the casino area, and I went up and said I saw the documentary, and I really appreciate hearing that story, because that took some fucking balls. And he was like, thank you. The other thing, what was it? Oh, with the popularity, Morbid Angel, it was interesting. Obviously, they had the 2 music videos that got a lot of attention, but and then the connection as well between extreme metal and other, quote, extreme things. I'll never forget David Vincent on the Where the Slime Lives is wearing an ECW t-shirt. So you have probably one of the most blatant connections between extreme metal and the wrestling world through that.
Yeah, that's true. And I think there's quite a lot of, I know that they did a joint split EP with Lieback or something. Not that Lieback are particularly mainstream, but it was sort of at that time when extreme metal was coming out of its bunker, as it were, and sort of melding with a lot of other alternative genres. In a way that it kind of industrial kind of has a parallel history in a lot of ways, in that it was thrust into the mainstream in the early 90s by the likes of Nine Inch Nails and stuff, which is interesting. But yeah.
To then bridge into the other point about the drum sound and more sound.
Yeah, so I teed you up for the snare sound of Arise into the drum sound at Morris Sound. It's going from incredibly broad to incredibly niche. Go for it.
Well, I think it's important to focus on, because in interviews I've heard it discussed. I think David Vincent and a few others talked about how one of the things they liked about Moorsound and Scott Burns and the other guy in the Moorsound brothers there is that they felt they were able to capture a good way of recording the double bass drums. That had always been a difficult thing, to kind of have the brutality of that while still having a certain level of clarity, that it didn't just become an entire mess. At least that's what the bands were kind of looking for, and that Scott and the other guys had done such a good job with that. And then again, to throw in the dialectical, I blame you for this, Shelley. I know in interviews, Fenriz has specifically said that was the issue that he had, and he claims that the black metal scene had one of the big issues with the death metal sound. That he said when Chuck did the 3rd death metal album and he heard the drum sound, he was just like, "Oh my god, what the fuck is this?" And then I think as well he said, "Blessed Are the Sick" could have been one of the best death metal albums if it weren't for the goddamn fucking drum sound.
Yeah, that was in the other Sam Dunn documentary, where he does a whole series on each metal subgenre, and then it's the extreme metal one where, I've seen that interview with Fenriz where he's talking specifically about death, and he kind of says, it's this clicky, triggered sound, and we need to get back to Celtic Frost, Hellhammer, where it's very, simple 4/4 beats, and you can hear the bass drum and stuff. And to some extent, I appreciate what you're saying, because I really appreciate the sound on an album like A Blaze in the Northern Sky, which was the initial reaction to that. But also, I should point out, it was Tom Morris that did the production on Altars of Madness and Blessed Are the Sick. And Blessed Are the Sick in particular, I know it comes under fire even from Morbid Angel fans for sounding way too clinical and precise. But I really like that album for how clean it sounds, even compared to anything released in 1991 and anything that Scott Burns has put out. Obviously, I love a lot of those albums from that time that Scott Burns produced, but Blessed Are the Sick is so striking and so different because it is so, I don't know, it's so sort of graceful in the way that it kind of sounds. It is clean and precise, but it doesn't sound like a, by the numbers tech death album that just sounds like it's come out of an industrial like Fordist production line. It sounds like it's sort of carved out of marble or something to me. But I definitely understand that when you're talking about an album like Cause of Death, which again I absolutely love Cause of Death, but the Trigger drums kind of do let it down a little bit. Or an album like I already mentioned, Demolition Hammer as well. Again, really appreciate their first album, but it does again sound like it's come off that production line. Sorry, someone about to chime in.
No, I was just gonna say that. I mean, I'm in full agreement with Blessed Are the Sick. Like, I have been accused, and it's probably fair to say, I can be a bit of a Fenris fanboy. But when his critiques of stuff like that with the Death album, especially Blessed Are the Sick, I don't agree. I think it's Morbid Angel's best album, in my personal opinion. And the marble comparison, I think is accurate. I think some of the grime had kind of been swept away, but it still has, it's marble, but it's like this Lovecraftian marble, as it were.
Yeah, it's still got character, but
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Tyler, do you want to jump in on that at all? Or?
I don't have too much to offer on that. I mean, if we're talking about Morbid Angel, I'm going to offer my typical opinion, which is that I personally like Abominations of Desolation the most. But I think that's to be expected from a man who has a copy of Morbid Visions in every room of his house.
I mean, I think we have discussed Blessed Are the Sick on our tier list, but yeah, at least you're not doing a Paul Ledney and saying I only like Thy Kingdom Come demo and that's it. But that's Paul Ledney, who's a special kind of guy.
Yeah, I mean, I think technically Abominations is pre Thy Kingdom Come, so
it is, yeah, true.
I'm out culting you, Paul Ledney. I hope you hear this.
Oh, I'd also be remiss that I watched earlier today. We're all familiar with, I take it, J-Dog from Hell's Heroes?
No.
I am. He's the guy behind Hell's Headbangers, right? And he does videos on YouTube where he interviews.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I said Hell's Heroes. I meant Hell's Headbangers, yeah.
Well, yeah, obviously I'm familiar with Hell's Headbangers, but I don't watch their YouTube channel. I just get sent their promos. But
you don't.
He looks like the Terminator, like Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yeah.
And yeah, he does interviews with a bunch of like death and black metal stuff. And
but there was I guess someone made a clip channel on YouTube for him because he often says some, he is not afraid to pick fights. And he'll often have guests on and encourage them to pick fights about other bands. But I watched a clip today where he was interviewing Glenn from Deicide, and after kind of making some comparisons between black metal and death metal, Glenn promptly said that Euronymous was a 4'5" Party City vampire.
Yeah, I saw that same clip, and he was talking about how he could lift Euronymous up with his pinky
finger. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was like, Glenn, look at that. Look at that beer belly. The only thing you're lifting up with your pinky finger is another beer. Come on,
admittedly, that would have been 92 or whatever.
Yeah.
So
yeah, 92. Yeah. He was probably more in shape. But just hearing that from old balding beer belly Glenn Benton, I was like, come on, man.
And then as well, I mean, it's interesting. Deicide thematically, along with Morbid Angel, was kind of the closest to black metal in some ways. But Well, yeah, I don't even think it was the black metal scene that went after him, because there were, those supposed incidents of black metal heads like giving death threats to death metal bands on tour and stuff. I think that was more the Swedish bands, but
it was the Swedish bands. It was animal rights groups that went after Glenn Benton.
Well, yeah, and they tried to set off a bomb at a show, I think in Stockholm, at a show that Glenn was doing. So, yeah, that was
he
interesting.
shot a squirrel apparently.
Yeah, which apparently Corthrone was there doing security.
Oh, that's a weird crossover.
Indeed.
Also, Corthron's not a big dude. I would not be threatened if he was doing security.
No.
But anyway.
Yeah, probably just did it for some money or something, or Lord knows what.
Yeah. So Joseph, do you have a last point to bring up about Chuck and Trey, or is this going to be, let's do a teaser for another episode?
I mean, we could touch on that. I was talking, so the audience can know, I was watching one of Shelley's videos on hate meditations, and there was a comparison made between Chuck and Trey, and not entirely inaccurate, this notion of Trey kind of being somewhat palpable to a more mainstream or conventional audience, and then Trey just sort of being this outsider that couldn't quite fit. And I see that there's definitely elements of that I think is accurate. But the one thing I would say is it's not like Trey and Morbid Angel as a unit didn't pursue larger mainstream success. Obviously, like we were talking about with the major labels involved, and Morbid Angel probably getting their music videos played more than Death, arguably. Like the Death music videos, I mean, The Philosopher is somewhat theatrical, but I mean, you watch like God of Emptiness or, you know, some of these other ones, they're pretty eye-catching and narrative-based. So I'm not entirely sure that Trey was opposed to mainstream success. I think Trey just kind of goes about ways that aren't neurotypical. So it oftentimes seems weird or off kilter, but he's definitely a guy who I think has interest in so many different places that in some of those are hardly I don't know, intentionally trying to be underground.
I don't think the point was that he's opposed to mainstream success. I think it's the fact that he's ambivalent to it. When he actively goes after it, you get something like the Latin Il Divin Insanus album.
Yeah.
Obviously, it was a famous disaster, but like, and again, that's not to say that Chuck actively pursued mainstream success either. I think, as we sort of unpacked at length, like he was very much doing his own thing, to varying degrees of success. But he was always much more aware of his audience and feedback, and much more sensitive to it in a way. And
yeah,
I think sorry, go on.
No, I think that's probably true. I think Chuck probably had a larger immediate role in Def's own business decisions, whereas certainly Morbid Angel infamously had a manager who handled a lot of that. And I think that's partially because the personalities in Morbid Angel never would have allowed for enough focus to get things done.
I think it's probably not unreasonable to say that by the time that Morbid Angel released Covenant, they were bigger than Death. Like, as we already mentioned, they were on a major level. They were getting MTV time. They were a name outside of death metal. But posthumously, Chuck is now a much more influential figure on death metal. And to some extent, that's part of the tragedy of Chuck himself, in that, you know, it was obviously awful what happened, and it's great that his legacy is now being appreciated, but at the same time, I almost lament that kind of side of Chuck is what's being celebrated, in that it's the sort of post-spiritual. Well, actually, you disagree with this, and that you think that Scream, Bloody Gore, and Leprosy are the albums that are more appreciated, and I think you could very much make a case for that, and I do see a lot of celebration for those albums. But I also see in the much wider crowd, like wider metal crowd beyond death metal itself, he is very much respected for what he did from Human onwards.
Oh, no, for sure. I think that's...
Whilst none of that's to be lamented, I think that does make Death a bigger name now than Morbid Angel are. I think if you'd asked me that in the mid-90s, I think Morbid Angel would be the bigger band. But now I think, just in terms of the number of new material from bands that I have to pass, more of them are more clearly influenced by Death, consciously or unconsciously, than they are Morbid Angel. That's purely anecdotal, I'm aware, but...
No, I think with influence, I think that's true, but I think that's also because, again, the primacy of death being there so early, that death has, I mean, Morbid Angel, I feel like is, even though they did evolve, it's always been sort of the same influence, the same sort of style they've had, while they've experimented quite a bit within the boundaries of it. Outside of that one album, I feel like Morbid Angel has a particular style, while his Death has almost two separate eras, and both of those eras have almost worked as like separate bands to influence. You have the early stuff of Scream Bloody Gore and Leprosy kind of impacting the scene in one way, and then Human on through Symbolic and Sound of Perseverance influencing the other end of it.
Yeah. Again, this is maybe where we do need to break out into another episode, because I find Formulas Fail to the Flesh and Gateways to be, they are very much Trey albums, but they are highly kind of experimental in their own way, in a way that I find just fundamentally more interesting than I do individual thought patterns or
Yeah, no, I'd probably agree.
Yeah,
but the other thing too that
they're less obviously progressive with a capital P. But
I mean, Morbid Angel has generally been a consistent live act, whereas until the the other guys other than Chuck kind of forming and playing live, which is a very recent development. Morbid Angel certainly have been able to be a larger presence in people's lives because they do play live.
Yeah, true. But I think, I don't know, like, I don't really have any statistics to back it up because I don't think there are, but I do just think in general Death's shadow is now, maybe from post 2010 onwards, has just been that much more influential than Morbid Angel. But we're talking two massive like pillars of foundational pillars of death metal at large here. Like, I think part of the point I was trying to make is that because by the time Death took a progressive turn, he was calling on these earlier influences, this sort of progressive thrash era, and you mentioned even like even earlier than that in terms of like heavy metal as well. They're almost easier to imitate in a lot of ways, whereas Trey's riff style, his soloing style is so idiosyncratic that I hear flourishes of it in other bands, but it's unimitatable in the same way that a band like Autopsy or Death or Suffocation is. I'm interested to get Tyler's take on this just before we close.
I don't know. It's difficult to.
You don't have to have a take. We can literally do a sequel if you want.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's kind of difficult to kind of have, like, I don't know if I have too much of an opinion on this. It's not something I've thought about too in depth. Yeah, I almost would want to table this discussion for another time when I've had some time to ponder it.
Let's table it then.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, we have been going for over 2 hours, so we probably should stop at some point. Alrighty. Well, yeah, like I said, it's always a sign of a good discussion when I think I could go on for another 2 hours when I've already been talking about it for 2 hours. But yeah, that was an absolutely fascinating unpacking of not just the Floridian death metal scene, but the formative years of death metal and its weird late adolescence in the mid to late 90s as well. So thank you very much for that. And maybe we'll do a sequel to this where we discuss like where death metal went in like the 21st century. But as always, Tyler, absolute pleasure to have you on board as always. And I'm sure we'll be doing plenty more of these focus episodes going forwards, with hopefully a revolving door of different guests. So yeah, great to have you on.
Thank you. It was great to be here. Look forward to doing some more.
And likewise for you, Joseph. As I said, you've always got some fascinating anecdotes and insights into some of these bands, and you're always like, challenging myself and Tyler on some of our views, because I think myself and Tyler, we do diverge quite a lot, but we can become a bit of an echo chamber sometimes, and it's always really appreciated when you come in and throw a curveball in, because it really does challenge us. But also, you're a fount of knowledge when it comes to some of this. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you. And I mean, I enjoy being challenged as well, which makes this intellectually stimulating.
It's all about the dialectic.
You